Hello and welcome back to another exploration of the book of Romans. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I'm presenting these videos going along with a Bible study on the book of Romans going on in my congregation. We are meeting weekly and have a discussion, and then I do this the next day just kind of as a companion for those who were not able to be there, just sort of video recap for what we had talked about. This particular week, we're kind of looking at Romans chapter 5.5, sort of. But if you happen to catch last week's video, or if you were in our discussion last week, you know that we did the first half of chapter 5. And now this week we finished up the tail end of chapter 5. Did not get into chapter 6, which was a possibility, but we decided to put that on hold until the next time we meet. So we went through, again, the back half, picking up at verse 12 and going through the end of chapter 5 of the book of Romans. And interestingly enough, as we discussed this, it was a little bit of a turnaround. Excuse me. If you happen to catch things from last week, or the first half of chapter 5 is extraordinarily hopeful. What we had discussed last time around was how Paul reveals the lengths that God has gone to in order to grant us salvation, or to justify us, through the work of Christ, through that redemptive work of Christ. And that really centered around the idea, kind of found through verses 6 through 11, that speaks to, while we were sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still weak at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. That's the sense that the reminder, very Lutheran in its understanding of salvation at this point. That when did Christ work on our behalf? Did we have to achieve any certain sort of status before God would work on our behalf? And the answer is no. That in the midst of our sinfulness, in the midst of our, if you want to use the word depravity, you could, but in the midst of when we were doing that which is against the will of God, therefore when we were enemies of God, Christ died for us. That was really the focal point of that first half. Now, the second half of Romans 5 gets a little heady, which, of course, Paul's writings can at times. There are portions of it that are very, very difficult to kind of try and wrap our heads around. And we experienced some more of that. We've had some of that in some past chapters before, where things were kind of heavy and were hard to wrap our heads around. And our discussion kind of went there a little bit. But the focal point of this second half of chapter 5 is kind of a comparison between Adam and Christ. Now, there are times when Christ is called the second Adam because of this section. And what that's talking about is that sin entered our reality, entered the experience of humanity through one person, that being Adam. Now, interestingly enough, that's a little weird because, well, Eve was there too, and they were both sinful. But both of them in the garden disobeyed the command of God. God basically gave them the garden to live in, and everything was good, and everything was cared for, and they were in good relationship with God. And He said, "You may eat of anything of the tree except that one tree, the one in the midst of the garden. Don't eat from that one." And then they were deceived, and they ate of it, breaking the will of God, and sin entered the world. And so we hear about that sin came into the world through one man, death through sin, and then and so death spread to all because all have sinned. So that's kind of the first part. And then there's talk about, then we have the law come back in there. And this is kind of where we started tripping up, because Paul makes a statement that, I got to find it here. That when the law came, sin increased. We really snagged up in that part as we tried to wrap our heads around it. One of the things that we often do in our discussions is we look at different translations. A lot of times I'll access the Greek and try and look at that directly and get some more insights that way. But what we really tripped up on is what is Paul saying here? That there was sin, and then the law came, and sin increased, and we couldn't figure out exactly what that meant. We had some theories, some speculation. It seems that perhaps once the law came and pointed out our sin, because that seems to be the purpose that the law fulfills now, that then we attempted to justify ourselves. And this human tendency that we have to want to know that we're okay, justification, that has the tendency to ramp up when we see this list of, okay, well, this is what I'm supposed to do. Now, we work that much harder to try and use that to justify ourselves. And so that was kind of the sense that we tried to make of this idea that there was sin, and then the law came and sin increased. But the important thing that we eventually got to is the second part of that, is that but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. And this is in verse 20, if you're curious. And that kind of shoots us back to that first part of chapter 5, where we recognize that in the midst of our darkness, let's just say that, in the midst of our sinfulness, Christ died for us. The grace of God was on display in Christ's sacrifice that justifies us, that makes salvation possible, that brings us back into good relationship with God. And so again, we continue to like hammer on this, and we weren't really getting anywhere. But then it kind of came up in our discussion that sin and grace, neither one of them are something that can be quantified. We can't apply a value to them. And the analogy that came up is there's not some scoreboard. It's not like, okay, you're now at sin level 7, so now grace is at 8. That idea could maybe be helpful as an illustration, but that's not how it works. The thing that we cling to, the thing that the promise is that the grace of God is bigger than sin, that it's large enough to overcome. And again, I'm trying to use size or value to apply or quantify, and you can't do it. But the promise is that the grace of God is bigger, stronger, faster, $6 million man apparently, than the sin that is within us, that's within the world, that God's redemptive act through Christ overcomes that, because it's greater. The grace of God is greater than the badness of sin. I'm using really weird words here, and I recognize that, but that's the sense, that it's not, they're not equal values. They don't offset one another. Grace is bigger. It abounds more. And that's really kind of the sense that we got in this back half of chapter 5, and that just as Paul tells us, just as sin came in through the actions of one person, Adam, sin was overcome through the actions of one person, that being Jesus. Now, Jesus is also God, so this is God at work, and this is the promise of God made on our behalf, the action of God done on our behalf. It's not about us. It's about what God has done and said about us, and that is the sense that we cling to in terms of the idea of hope. That hope is trusting and believing that which we cannot see, that which we cannot prove. And yet we cling to it anyway. And that was kind of one of our final bits of discussion as well, that we recognize our own brokenness. And the promise is that God's grace is bigger than that. Do we believe it? Do we believe that Jesus is big enough? And the phrase that I used is, I hope so. And that's not, I don't say that like, man, I hope so. It's more that I put my hope in that. That is what I cling to, that God's grace is bigger than my brokenness. So that's kind of what was going on here in this back half of chapter 5. Again, we didn't get into chapter 6. We're going to tackle that next time. We are not going to meet next week, so no video next week. We'll dive into chapter 6 in 2 weeks, which will be first week of March. So just FYI on that. Otherwise, if you have questions, comments, thoughts based on Romans 5, share those down in the comment section. We will continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, have a great week, and we'll catch you next time.